has graciously provided some intro to the Into the Impossible podcast music. It's playing in the background. Let's see if people are actually out there on the web. It is Brian Keating. We are joined today by none other than a friend, an inspiration to many, and that is Garrett Lisi. And it all is sounding good. Let me know in the chat room, how do we sound out there? All right. I can hear myself, so that is a good sign. There's Garrett Lisi. Garrett, how are you doing today, my friend?
Hey, Brian. It's a great day in Hawaii. Not sure how it is in San Diego, but usually nice.
Yeah, it's brutal. It's pretty brutal. I mean, there's a cloud over there I can see out in the distance. And we're just going to reminisce about some of your early days, your formative years here in San Diego, all the way up through to what you're up to today. So first, let me introduce to the very few people. There's over 100 plus people watching on YouTube right now, probably more on Facebook. And we will be joined later on by our mutual friend, Dr. Eric Weinstein, who is going to join us for a separate live stream at 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. That'll be basically when this live stream solo episode with the world-renowned Garrett Lisi ends, and then we'll go into a
lay it on kind of thing, Brian.
Yeah, they might get overexposed. They might feel Garrett's been overexposed. Garrett Lisi is an American theoretical physicist. He works as an independent researcher without an academic position. We're going to talk about that. He is a proponent of the balance between scientific research and enjoyment of the natural universe. I find that so inspirational that you can do both. Garrett, how do you do it all? How do you nurture the inner wandering planetary soul that you have with this desire that you have to unify all of physics?
Well, honestly, the only way to do it all is to kind of do it all badly. I do the best I can.
Well, I see you as kind of the skinny Buddha of physics. In addition to the hairstyle, which, as we were talking before we went live, your hair is a lot easier to get ready in the morning each day than my hair probably.
Well, I'm also getting less skinny. You know, I put on the COVID-10, as did just about everybody. So yeah, I'm less skinny now.
Yeah, but not our friend Eric Weinstein. He is. I'm gonna have a beatdown on him later because he came out of. I promised anyone who comes out of COVID with a six-pack, I'm gonna kill, or at least beat down.
That's just not right.
And Eric's just he's gotten buff, as you'll notice when he comes on live. Anyway, you've done many things in your life. You started your career here. Tell us, what is your world line? What brought you to physics? What makes you interested in physics? And what was your actual career path to take you into academia and then out of academia as you are now?
Well, wow. I mean, I started out as a kid just reading sci-fi and fantasy books and really loving them. And I was also good at mathematics in school. So when in high school, I started taking my first physics classes and finding out that the mathematics I was learning and kind of developing a facility with actually applied to describe our physical world, much like magic underlies science fiction and fantasy stories quite often. It was really fantastic. It was like, wow, there is a magical language underneath our universe, and it's math. And that was just the moment I was hooked. Ever since then, it was just diving deeper into mathematical physics and how our world works in different ways that are fascinating. And I just kept going with that. And I also have always loved flying stuff. So I actually started out aerospace engineering at UCLA. But I think it was the first career day as in the UCLA aerospace engineering, where we went down to an engineering firm and walked out onto the floor of an engineering company and just saw wall-to-wall cube farm of rotund engineers typing away at computers, working on the electronics for drones. And I'm like, yeah, no, I'm out. No way. I want to do that. So I think it was the next day I changed my major and took on a physics major and then also added a math major. And then after that, it was just sort of natural to go to graduate school. And I almost went to Berkeley, but San Diego, A, had better surf, and B, offered me more money to go there.
Really? I didn't know that we were competing with the Bears to the north. Is that
yeah.
Really? Wow, I didn't know that. Maybe it's just with people like you, not with people like me.
So actually, and that's ultimately how I ended up being able to move to Maui, is because I got paid twice as much as a normal graduate student. And graduate students don't usually get paid much, but I was also having this Regent Fellowship grant money given to me. And so I took that, and in the 90s, I invested all of that in Apple stock. And so that let me. And
Isn't
then
that what Tom Hanks did in, in
yeah, it has a
Forrest
little
Gump?
bit of a Forrest Gump element to it. That's this fruit company. It sounded great, so I just put all my money into that. I like apples, sure. No, it's actually because Steve Jobs' company Next had bought Apple for a negative amount of money, and I knew that Next had a really good operating system because I had been using their workstation to work on my graduate thesis, and I knew it was gonna be awesome. So I put all my investments in there, and Steve Jobs totally revitalized the company, and their stock went crazy, and I was able to move to Maui and surf a lot, which is a great thing to do if you can pull it off. You know, people always ask me, it's like, well, how do I spend time working more on physics and the stuff I love? It's like, oh, make lots of money in the stock market and then go do what you want.
Yeah, I mean, usually we hear about survivorship bias in academia a little bit differently than that.
I'm a horrible data point. Don't follow my example.
Now, talk about your experience here as a Triton at UC San Diego. Who was your advisor? What was your major focus area? Was that always the case that you were interested in theoretical physics? And then ultimately, the decision, you make light of it, but of course, you know, I'm sure there was a struggle. I'm sure there was a component of a fear, doubt, uncertainty, FUD.
Mostly by my parents.
Yeah,
they
so
had all
talk
the fear,
about
doubt,
that.
and
Talk about
uncertainty,
that.
and I was fine.
They just wanted you to become a doctor, you know.
Well, I mean, I graduated, you know, near the top of my class, and they're like, "Oh, what's he gonna do next? What's he gonna do next? Wait, he's moving to Maui to be a surf bum. What? What just happened?" But no, UCSD. It was just, I really loved it. I moved to a house in Windansea Beach that was just walking distance from a wonderful surf break that I could go every morning if I wanted to. And then, you know, drive up to campus and bike in or skateboard in because parking's impossible.
Yeah, still is, still true.
Yeah. And so I started out, I never even had the slightest inkling to go into experimental physics. My lab friends wouldn't let me in their labs. It was like, what happens when we turn this knob to 11, you know? It's like, yeah, bad things, don't touch that. But I've always been enamored with theory, especially on the more mathematical side, and really fell in love with general relativity and particle physics, but also with nonlinear dynamics and using computers to numerically simulate things in our world. So my graduate career was kind of a mix of all those things. And I started out in nonlinear dynamics, but I was also doing quantum field theory courses. So I ended up finding a numerical solution to a quantum field theory equation that nobody thought existed. And my advisor at the time was Henry Barbanel, who was a nonlinear science chaos guy, but he had some background in particle physics. He said, well, why don't you go show this to Roger? And Roger Dashin was the head of the department at UCSD at that time.
Yeah.
And I came and showed it to him, and he's like, oh, this is really interesting. He's done work on solitons in the past. So he took me on. I switched advisors to him. And I was doing particle physics and working on this soliton solution. And I, had a talk with Sidney Coleman briefly. And he's like, well, that's interesting, but it doesn't really make sense physically, so it's probably nothing. And I'm like, well, that's a little demoralizing, but okay. It's like, is this still going to be my thesis, or is something else going to be my thesis? I don't know. But then Roger sadly made the decision for me by dying in the middle of a seminar. Mm-hmm. So he had a massive heart attack in the middle of a seminar, and
tragic. Yeah.
There was CPR didn't work. I remember putting my sweatshirt under his head, but it was just a massive coronary, and there was no bringing him back. So that was bad. Also a testament to keep staying in good shape, because he was a rather rotund fellow who smoked a pack a day. So that was also no good.
Yeah, I never met him, but of course his influence looms large even today.
Yeah, he's just a great guy. But anyway, at that time, UCSD had just started bringing in Ken Intrigator and a bunch of other string theory people, and they were really going heavily into string theory. Mm-hmm. And so no one knew what to do with me, because I was working on solitons and quantum field theory, which is far removed from string theory. And they tried to pivot me over to working on ADS CFT, which was all the rage, back in the 90s, and somehow grew even more from that. So they were right about pointing me that way for the popularity standpoint, but the whole time I'm in Ken's office going, what does this have to do with physical reality? They seem to be talking about a universe we weren't in. And although it was pretty mathematics, and I appreciate pretty mathematics, it just didn't seem to apply to our physical universe. And that's been my beef with string theory. It's just a really fancy toolkit that's really great for doing some things, but there's no indication it applies to our universe. And all the optimism they had for how well it was going to do, none of it panned out. Absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. Using higher dimensions, which is an old idea from Kluge-Klein, that's great, but they couldn't get the standard model out right. They couldn't get anything to work without super partners. So there are all these particles that are supposed to show up, none of them showing up, and it's just string theory was just a train wreck. And I sort of saw that coming in the 90s, and I'm like, I've got some stock investment money, I'm just gonna go do my own thing. And so that's what I did, and it was the most questionable decision I've ever made in my life, but it turned out to be a fantastic one. Just to skip out and do my own thing.
Yeah, having the courage to do that, we'll talk about later. My patented final thrilling three questions. I'll ask you what gave you the courage to go into the impossible, as befits the name of this podcast. But until then, I want to go into something right now. I received a book today. I get a lot of unsolicited books. And by the way, for those of you joining us, it's Garrett Lisi on the Into the Impossible podcast. Garrett and I are both doctors, and we both recommend you stretch your fingers to avoid carpal tunnel syndrome. Press the subscribe button, hit the thumbs up button, and leave a comment if you have a favorite theory of everything. We're going to be talking with Eric Weinstein in about an hour, 45 minutes or so. But that might be obviated, Garrett, because I get these books on a weekly basis mailed to my office here in San Diego. And please don't mail me more books, because I've got enough to read. But here, I got a theory of everything. This is from Norbert Schweitzer. I mean, this guy wrote a book. I mean, you wrote a paper. But tell me, first of all, Steelman.
Somehow these people find me too, Brian.
Well, I always get this funny comment. I'm sure you've gotten it too. Dr. Lisi, Dr. Keating, I get it. Einstein was wrong. I can prove it. And if I do prove it wrong, I will share the Nobel Prize with you. But I'm, not good at math. And I always say I'm probably worse at math. And I told this to Adam Rees a couple months back, and he said, yeah, how do you think I won the Nobel Prize? He answered those emails, but please don't send those emails. But seriously, this guy's got, it's a lot of math. This guy speaks math. This is Norbert Schweitzer. He's got graphs. He's got waves. He's got, but before we get to alternative theories of everything, a Fermat universe is what this is called. Steelman for me, if you would, string theory. What are the best attributes of string theory? Then I'm going to ask you to strawman E8, and then we're going to go on to update recent developments in your theory, not only of E8, but also in cosmology, as you put it, a deforming Lie group. But first, Steelman string theory. What's awesome about string theory?
All right. Well, what's awesome about string theory is all the surprises that came out and strengthened confidence in the theory. I mean, getting quantum anomaly cancellation in the theory was very encouraging, and I think that's what brought Witten on board when he first saw that, and that really got steam rolling in popularity. Also, the idea of just membranes oscillating in higher dimensions, that's a very flexible and rich area to investigate, both mathematically and potentially with the application in physics. So string theory did take advantage of things that had been very successful, like Kluge-Klein theory, which is this idea of adding extra dimensions to space-time that are compactified into very small shapes, and letting the strings vibrate in those dimensions. You're able to get things that look more like elementary particles as excitations. So it does hold a lot of promise, mostly for the quantum aspects. Also, the avoidance of singularities. So in particle physics, when things are interacting and they come and they interact at points, I mean, anytime you come infinitely close, you get infinitely strong interactions, at least classically. So the idea of spreading things out as membranes, right, where everything's just one membrane inside a larger geometry, allows you to avoid singularities, and that's very appealing.
Mm-hmm.
So for all those reasons, string theory was very appealing. The problem, of course, is that you seem to be able to build everything with this toolkit except the universe we're actually in.
Because explaining why for listeners who might not be familiar.
Well, it's just not actually very natural to get our standard model fermions out. To get general relativity out is non-trivial, and all these things are just it's kind of awkward to get it, and they were hoping that, like, with the right tweaks, you'd get the masses for the fermions out and the CKM matrix and mixings and everything, but it's just it turned out to be extremely convoluted to try to get it. And once you take a theory and you have to tweak it that much to get it to match up to known physics, you lose if you're rational about it, you have to lose confidence in it.
Mm-hmm. So those are some of the pros and cons of it. Before we go on to that, I'm getting some awesome questions from the audience. Let me take one right now. I don't want to get too distracted because I've got so much stuff I want to get to before our mutual friend Eric comes on. This is from a viewer, Sibi Eski, who asked you a question. If geometry is derived from space-time, and if space-time is emergent, then is a geometric description going far enough towards a real theory of everything? In other words, it's sort of a recursion or regress here.
Right. I would say it's not quite right to say that geometry just derives from space-time, or even that it depends on space-time. I think it's more accurate to say space-time can be described as geometry, and that ultimately you have to look to mathematical descriptions of geometry, such as differential geometry and Lie groups and representation spaces, and all these mathematical tools, and see how nicely they match up with known physics. And after you do that enough, you start to build a real confidence in that, yes, our universe fundamentally must be geometric, and geometric in a very foundational mathematical way. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the basic building blocks of mathematics and the mathematical description of geometry just applies very cleanly and directly to give very accurate descriptions of our world experimentally. So you build up more of an accurate description that way, and then you have to then figure out how extreme you go about this thing. Like, is our universe mathematics, as Max Tegmark would like to say?
That's right.
Or is it? He's fond of the idea that it's the exploration of all mathematics. I'm a little more inclined on the side of, I think it's some especially beautiful mathematics, that our universe is sort of this beautiful geometry come to life.
And we want to talk a little bit about beauty in reference to a particular critic who we've all been together with, a woman by the name of Dr. Sabine Hassenfelder, who is an eminent scientist in her own right, a good friend, the person you don't want to talk to when you're contemplating career suicide, because she might just push you over the metaphorical ledge. And yet we love her, and she performs a very valuable service, I think. Although I think, and I pointed this out to her in a Twitter battle that we had last week. I don't know if you saw the trolling by Frank Wilczek, past guest on this show, but she put out a tweet that something to the effect that beauty is of no use to physics. And then Frank Wilczek wrote back, "It worked out pretty well for me."
Oh, that's fantastic.
Which I thought was the ultimate troll. But then,
that's really good.
Then we got into it.
Both Sabina and Frank Wilczek are wonderful people, and I like them both the incredible amount.
Yeah. Well, they say the most wonderful things about you too. But I want to kind of quote from her, in that she put out this tweet or this video about you, Stephen Wolfram, who's been a guest on the show, and Eric in particular. Interesting, she didn't really bring up Max, who we also had a Theory of Everything symposium on the Into the Impossible channel. Please go back and check over the archives. We did that with PBS Spacetime. About 1 million people tuned in over the summer. Nice. But one of the videos that actually prompted me to say, I got to get my friend Garrett on the Into the Impossible podcast, is this video where she put out, I don't have time for your Theory of Everything. Right. And it really was just that. She doesn't look into it. She doesn't think it's useful from the perspective of making progress in physics, and yet she salutes you. She thinks thousands of flowers should bloom. Is she just being, kind to a friend, or is she really saying something of value? Because it seems to me if she were to take you seriously, it's almost like this, they say the benign bigotry of low expectations. She's saying, like, I'm not even going to look at it, but it's really good that they're doing this. How do you respond to her and her criticism of these beautiful fields that you have just mentioned yourself in your own words just 2 minutes ago?
I think her criticisms are valid and should be weighed highly. I think that without experimental checks, physics can and has gone off the rails into just exploration of beautiful theories that just don't happen to connect to our universe. And at that point, when they no longer connect even in principle, it's no longer physics. Right? It's just philosophizing about the way a universe could be using mathematics. And I do like her a lot as a friend. And I think if you have a good friend, you can have contrary views with your friends and maintain a good friendship. It's just that her and I views on beauty in mathematical physics are directly opposed. I think beauty is a good guide for physics. I think people have just been using that in the string theory direction and saying things like supersymmetry are beautiful. Even Wilczek holds that view, often much to his financial detriment.
Yes.
But it's just people have different ideas of beauty, and that's valid. And I think in terms of this let a million flowers bloom, I also support this idea that people should be exploring different directions and different ideas of what they consider beautiful in developing theories to ultimately apply to the real world. But I do also think that, very much in agreement with Sabina, that ultimately experiment has to be the ultimate decider of what is good physics. Mm-hmm. I mean, it doesn't matter how beautiful your ideas are if they can't even in principle come back and be tested. They're not physics.
Mm-hmm. And when people think about beauty, I often point out she makes the tautological kind of assignment that physics is theoretical physics. And I point out that almost I don't know of a non-beautiful experiment. And I don't mean that literally like, looking at the Michelson-Morley experiment was beautiful. I mean, it was beautiful. But if you look at like the transistor, you've seen it probably. The first transistor was like chewing gum and a big like wire coat hanger. It was ugly, but it was beautiful because a lot of what goes into experimental physics is predicated on the fact that nature has certain properties, namely symmetry, in that, if I take data from my Simons Observatory telescope on a Tuesday, the universe doesn't care if I took data on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, and therefore if I difference the data taken on Tuesday from the data taken on Wednesday, I should see basically a signal consistent with noise. And so we use the symmetry, the beautiful symmetry of nature, much to our advantage in experimental physics. So I always kind of rail against her basic equivalence that's false, that says physics should not be beautiful. No, physics should be. It depends on what you're calling physics. But don't leave out experiment. And that brings me to my next topic. Why do you think there's so many theories of everything? I mean, you just listed 5 of them, and yet there's so few experiments of everything. I never get an email, Dr. Keating, I've got this idea for an experiment theory that will test, all of physics.
You never get perpetual motion machines described in your emails? Come on.
I get those. Well, that's what's powering the lights. We're in California. We got rolling blackouts otherwise.
My favorite one is the cat with the peanut butter and jelly on top, just spin.
But talk about some of the other theories of everything. Let's talk about that for a second, because.
Well, I mean, I want to address your question.
Yeah,
first,
go ahead.
Which is, why do you get so many more, theoretical ideas floating around instead of experimental one? And I think the easy question is cost. Mm-hmm. It's just it costs nothing basically to scrawl out an idea on paper and send it around. Or to type something up on the internet. That's almost zero cost. Whereas to build an experimental apparatus that actually gets at some fundamental aspect of nature now has gotten prohibitively expensive for individuals. You pretty much only get, all the low-hanging fruit has already been taken over the past couple hundred years. So now if we want to get access to more insights in fundamental physics, it's going to cost us an enormous amount.
Well, let me just push back with respect and great deference, but let me push back on that. So if you look at, the ultraviolet catastrophe, or you look at the infrared divergences, those were aspects of quantum field theory that could have been understood and were understood in the 1800s. In other words, predating. And go back to Newton. So Newton and Herschel observed that the prism, a glass prism, can diffract light and make these beautiful rainbow patterns, and you'll get a spectrum. Then Herschel took out a thermometer and put it beyond the red and demonstrated there was power, energy, heat contained in rays beyond the red. We call that infrared radiation to this day. Those were tools, literally, that my 4-year-old can appreciate. So it's not necessary that all the and just recently we've seen data. I had on Avi Loeb recently. He's going to be on Tuesday to talk about his new book, Extraterrestrial. He claims that there could be data from past experiments that could indicate the presence of alien civilization. So I don't know that it's true. I think that we tend to look for the future and say, oh, we need the next big hadron collider. We need the future circular collider. Then I'll prove my theory right. But in fact, there's probably a lot of data. And actually, a side project that you and I and Eric will talk about is this assayer project that I have to maybe fund the mining of data with machine learning and AI of already acquired data. In other words, let's not look for the next few $100 billion collider to be our salvation.
Yeah, it's not as sexy to look for some signal in the noise that other people have already sifted through and may have missed.
Yeah. But with, present company accepted, most physicists aren't that concerned with being sexy in other fields of life. Okay, although you do pose shirtless in many of your videos, which I'll salute, and we'll talk about. So I want to talk about E8. You announced this to great fanfare, and as you know, a colleague here by the name of Jorge Hirsch was the creator of something known as the H Index, which is really the precursor in some sense. Although I think Jorge, you correct me if I'm wrong, Garrett, but I think Jorge came up with it after Google. So in other words, Google PageRank effectively does a form of H-index searching, which important samples papers that are not just by number of citations, but by number of citations that are that have that number of citations. So it's sort of a little bit more deep than just raw. A single paper having 1 billion citations is not enough to be as valid.
Yeah, I actually TA'd for a couple of Jorge's physics classes. So he's an absolutely great guy.
Yeah, I love Jorge, and he's an iconoclast too, and of course Sabina doesn't really care too much for some of the stuff that he does. But anyway, let's not talk about her. Let's talk about what he came up with, this H index, which is the number of papers that have at least H citations, and that's your H index. So if you have 5 papers and they have 5 citations each, your H index would be 5. But if only one of them has 5, then your H index might be 1 or something like that. So it's the number of papers that have at least H citations. When you have this literally extraordinary theory that's gotten tremendous amount of attention, and with the attention comes criticism. So what do you put to the stock of, like, how do you weight the H index versus the TEDx index, or how do you weight this kind of popular meme culture versus the actual currency of scientific attribution?
I think it's really good at what it's for, which is measuring the success in the community of contributions in the literature, and for the purpose of academic hiring. Like, do you want to hire this person? Well, their H index is a good measure of how well received their contributions are within the community. Except you have to get rid of self-citations somehow. I'm not sure if the H index handles that well.
Not really, yeah. Thank God for my promotion, because.
But as an academic metric, I think it's good. If you look at my rather paltry H index, for me personally, it's both a combination of I haven't published that many papers. Also, I'm working outside academia, so I'm not motivated to climb an academic ladder in the same way. So I'm not motivated to try to boost my H index for any reason. I'm much more motivated to try to do better in the stock market. And if I'm publishing a paper, it's because I think I found something cool and I want to share it.
So let's.
My sort of public notoriety to academic success ratio is much larger than normal. And most academics would rightfully say, well, this guy somehow got a lot of publicity, but he didn't deserve it based on his work. And I'd say that's probably valid. I probably got much more attention than my work warranted, my actual physics work warranted. That doesn't mean the work I've done in physics is terrible. It just means that I've gotten a lot more attention than it probably deserved.
And when you think about, kind of the vogue fashion, how much of the string theory take of the oxygen availability, whether that's funding, whether that's public attention, as you say, there's very little of it that has been, confirmed, let alone, I should say it like this, there's very little of it that's possible to confirm. Although I want your reaction to something Kamran Vafa said on the show just last month, which was that when it comes to be your time to answer the final questions of this live stream, I ask each person, what would you put on a billion-year time capsule? And I'll ask you that so you can start multitasking, processing it right now. If you had a time capsule guaranteed to last longer than Lana Kea has been around, what would you put on it? And he said the equations of string theory, which I found absolutely flabbergasting. And I love Kamran, and he's incredibly.
Like which one's describing what?
So let's talk about E8. So let's talk about what was the motivation for it. Was it something you discovered? Did you invent it? What is so exceptional about it besides its name, which I know is a double entendre, as my French listeners will note? What is so exceptional about it?
Well, from a mathematical point of view, it is one of the most pretty jewels in mathematics. And it's not something that humans really created so much as that they discovered. Because, and this idea goes back and forth, and mathematicians are mostly Platonists in that they think that mathematics sort of exists independent of physical reality. But there's support for this. And the support for this is if you imagine any alien civilization playing with mathematical structures, eventually they're going to get to symmetric shapes of higher dimensions. And when they start classifying different shapes and different dimensions, they're going to hit essentially the structures of Lie groups. It's just something that's going to happen. Whatever your system of mathematics is, they're going to hit this structure of Lie groups. Mm-hmm. And you'll see the stack of Lie groups, and then you'll see the exceptional cases. And among the exceptional cases, E8 is the largest simple exceptional Lie group. And any alien civilization out there in whatever galaxy with advanced mathematics is going to hit this grouping of Lie groups and see it. So it's going to be it's something that's independent of mankind. It's not a creation; it's a discovery. And what wasn't known is whether this had any application to particle physics. The string theorists had played with it before because they play with everything. They have huge toolkits and it touches mathematics all over the place. But the thing that I got lucky with in finding is that I was looking at specifically at fermions, at matter particles, right, and how to get a mathematical description of them. Because back at UCSD, I had been learning general relativity and really loving it, but finding in my quantum field theory classes when we hit fermions, this is a fundamental constituent of matter of the universe is these fermions, which are spinor fields, and spinor fields are just not geometric the way a curving space-time is, right? So what's this? Is there some geometric description of spinor fields which are fundamental to the universe that matches up with general relativity? And there was nobody sort of working in this direction. Nobody even seemed to think it was a problem. So I was trying to figure out, okay, what are these spinor fields geometrically in a way that can be synced up with general relativity, with gravity? And in order to do this, I played around with higher dimensions in gravity, in which spinor fields didn't work well at all. So Kaluza-Klein theory sort of fails when you try to incorporate spinor fields into them. Mm-hmm. So then I was just on my own on an island. So after 5 years, I said, pitch it, just toss out that whole body of work. I don't have any graduate students, so it's just up to me. And then I started looking at, okay, what are the other forces and how do they interact with spinors and matter fields? So then I had, all right, if you take the standard model fermions and you interact with them with the electromagnetic force, the weak force, the strong force, and with gravity, you get this big algebraic structure. And it starts to look like one thing with all these, different algebraic generators acting on one large spinor field. And then, okay, well, I started looking, well, maybe this is part of one really big algebra. And I started looking at like large rotation groups. And then I'm a physicist, so I hadn't encountered the exceptional algebras before. The exceptional Lie groups are just like, they don't usually pop up in physics. But I started looking at the algebra for this E8 Lie algebra. And the structure I put together of the standard model with these different forces acting on the matter particles was a perfect fit in this E8 Lie algebra. And not only was it a perfect fit, but E8 also has this triality symmetry that suggested maybe 3 generations of matter particles could be described, and that was just freaking fantastic. So that's what spawned this paper, and I think it was on one of John Baez's fantastic This Week's Finds, where I saw this first saw this description of E8, and then it was icing on the cake that the thing's actually pretty. Mm-hmm. All right, so that. So I went kind of crazy with lovely plots of particles assigned to E8 roots and rotating them in different ways and showing that it's really pretty. And it's just that was really great, and I'm still very happy with having found that. And if I have a claim to fame, I'll take that one.
So, and update us now. My listeners are very curious about the current status of E8, and then we'll get into the cosmological implications of E8. And possible extensions of that beyond the original conception. But talk us through what's happened since. Obviously, you met a lot of flack. Not all of it was because of your courageous kind of persona and your extracurricular kind of notoriety. I'm saying that in a good way because I love that you just love life, and we have a limited amount of time on Earth, and you're thinking about these huge issues. And I salute that. But beyond that, so those are the ad hominem attacks. I'm not going to get into those. I think those are invalid. Right. Talk about some of the criticism, which is necessary because science is adversarial, science is provisional, right. Science is self-correcting in a sense, but science also has groupthink, pettiness, selfishness, jealousy. Yeah. So let's ignore those attributes of negative attributes. But talk about what are the legitimate criticisms of E8 as it stands in its current formulation.
Right. The legitimate criticism, and if you look back at the original paper, I'll say, well, here's the embedding of the standard model into E8 with 1 generation of fermions, and then E8 has these other parts, and maybe you can use triality and waving my hands just like I'm waving them now, to get 2 and a second and third generation of matter particles in there, like we see in particle accelerators. Okay, so our universe has these 3 generations. E8 has this structure that hints that maybe those could be linked to parts of E8. If you take the embedding that does work of the standard model into E8 and rotate it to these other 2 second and third generations, maybe that'll work. But it doesn't seem to want to work in the most obvious way. And the criticism I got was, this doesn't work at all. It can't possibly work. And the theory is just hopeless from the get-go. Can't work. And that was fine. I'm like, okay, well, yeah, that's probably valid. I think it's worth looking at. It seems promising. But if I'm the only one working on it, fine. But that's not really what the shape of the criticism was. If you look in detail at what the criticism was, it was like, no, even 1 generation of fermions doesn't fit in E8. And I'm like, that's just not right. I mean, it's right. I mean, it's right there. It's obvious. I even wrote another paper showing it even more explicitly. But the logic they were following is because it has this other piece in it, as well as the 1 generation of fermions, that makes the 1 generation of fermions not be in it. And I literally almost got in a brawl with one of the authors of the critical paper because he was using the word incorrectly. But anyway, the embedding of 1 generation is great. But over many years, I kept trying to see if I can get the second or third generation to work, and I couldn't do it. So I basically gave up on getting all 3 generations in E8, and at this point, I don't think it can work. So now I've moved on to working on larger structures in which maybe it can in a different way.
Well, so now we turn to more recent developments, which have to do with a cosmological interpretation. Now,
Right.
even I can, gently upbraid you for some of the things you do, which seem designed almost to troll the physics community, not unlike Frank Wilczek did with Sabina last week. But for example, the title, the abstract. And normally I don't have time to read the entirety of an abstract in a live stream like this. But the paper that you published about about E8 Lie group cosmology, rather,
Yeah.
the abstract is as follows: Our universe is a deforming Lie group. Come on, Garrett. You knew that would set people off. Although I don't disagree with some of the first statements that you make. To the best of our current knowledge, this is in the text, not the abstract. Yeah. The abstract is shorter almost than the title. That's very rare. Although I have seen some abstracts where it asks a question in the title and then the abstract is no. So. But the best of our knowledge, the universe exists as quantized excitations of a fiber bundle. Explain what you mean by that.
Okay. Our current description of quantum field theory, coupled with general relativity, as we understand it, is to imagine space-time as a four-dimensional manifold with Lie groups attached at every space-time point. Mm-hmm. And then also representation spaces of those Lie groups attached at every space-time point. Mm-hmm. And that this whole structure together is a fiber bundle, and that elementary particles are quantum excitations of this fiber bundle.
Now, when you say that that is the nature of the universe, can you say, like, what would be the evidence for that claim? I mean, if that's broken down into actually what cosmologists like, and keep in mind, I'm just a simple, humble experimentalist.
Right. So the evidence for that is, if you look at elementary particles, these are largely described by gauge theories. And gauge theories, the geometry behind a gauge theory is that of a principal bundle, which is a Lie group as the fiber over a manifold. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's this is the direct mathematical description of our known particle physics. Mm-hmm. Okay, and it's a very natural geometric description in terms of you can, and I use natural in the mathematical way, not in the physicist way, where to mathematicians working with geometry, natural means it can be described in terms of vector fields on manifolds. Mm-hmm. So this description of gauge theories is extremely well supported. In terms of how you go from the mathematics of gauge theories and to the mathematics of particle physics, and this is where basically my work and Eric's work match up. Mm-hmm. Is he's also fundamentally working with gauge theories, and I'm also fundamentally working with gauge theories. I've just come up with a way of basically deriving the gauge theory structure by starting just with a Lie group, and allowing the Lie group symmetry internally to break. So you allow a Lie group internally to deform. Mm-hmm. And when you deform a Lie group, it becomes a fiber bundle where the underlying manifold emerges as a subspace that's no longer has the symmetry it necessarily did. Mm-hmm. And you end up with a gauge field over it, as well as a what's called a frame, which gives you your metric for gravity on the subspace. So it's a really nice way. The idea behind Lie group cosmology is you can very wonderfully get all the structures of mathematical structures of a fiber bundle that you need for all of modern physics, just by starting with the Lie group and allowing it to deform.
Mm-hmm. So I want to make a general statement that I feel that people just take for granted that we need a theory of everything. And let me see if you appreciate this. Ouroboros like logic where you kind of have the snake eating its tail. So I always hear this, and I confronted people like Sir Roger Penrose about this, and I haven't really gotten a satisfactory answer. This is the argument. It normally goes like this: we need a quantum theory of gravity because we don't understand gravity in very strong, or the quantum nature of gravity in very strong gravitational fields, such as at the singularity of a black hole, or at the beginning of the universe, if indeed the universe emerged from a Big Bang scenario. So then I always point out, well, both of those things are forbidden from experimental evidence via the so-called boundary or Hawking or the event horizon in the case of a black hole, and the boundary conditions of the initial singularity are also firewalled off from us. And I had this conversation with John Preskill last week. In general, that physicists should adhere to what Feynman said, which is that I don't care if your theory is beautiful. I don't care how logical it may seem to you. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. And I said, John, what if, and he's the Feynman professor of physics and a good friend and influence. And he said, well, what do you do? I said, what do you do if you can't experimentally test it? And he really said, try harder. And I respect him, but the point that I'm trying to make is, what if God hands you an email, and it sends you an email like that movie God Friended Me, which or the TV show God Friended Me. I'm a religious watcher of it, no pun intended. But the point is, what if you find out there is no singularity at the beginning of time? Roger Penrose is right. There's a conformal cyclic cosmology. There's no initial singularity, and two, that the black holes never exist in naked singularity, so you'll never witness it. Therefore, I would say, do we need quantum gravity? What do you say?
I would say that we don't need quantum gravity in a practical sense. However, and I agree with you in that the universe did not necessarily start at some moment in time. It could be eternal. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you sort of follow the argument in this Lie group cosmology paper, that sort of speaks to an eternal cosmology where something was just expanding eternally from back in negative infinity. Mm-hmm. But in terms of whether there needs to be a theory of everything, there doesn't need to be one, but it seems compelling that as we learn more and more physics, as we've learned more about the existence of more and more particles, that it seems to have fleshed out a more complete looking set. Mm-hmm. So as we discovered more fermions, it fleshed out 3 complete generations and no more. And we seem to have and now it's getting harder and harder to find new particles. And we strongly suspect that dark matter is at least one, if not a bunch of new particles of some sort. But still, it looks like the picture that we have is getting more and more complete, but it's still kind of a mess. Mm-hmm. And
yeah, go on.
And for gravity itself, as you say, we don't have experimental access to the interior of black holes. So we might never be able to have access and experiment to such strong gravitational fields, but we could still potentially see quantum gravitational effects even in weaker gravitational fields. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there are, you can argue that if you just have to apply quantum mechanics to existing theories of gravity in some naive way, gravity has to have some quantum description in order to be consistent with the rest of quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So just for consistency, there has to be something going on in the universe with quantum mechanics and gravity, just for consistency. And we don't have a consistent theory of quantum gravity. So that's why there's motivation to look at it, even if we don't have experimental access to strong gravitational fields down at those tiny scales.
Great. Okay, well, we're due to bring in our friend Eric in just a bit, but not before I ask people to please subscribe to this channel. Push the subscribe button, exercise your finger, avoid carpal tunnel syndrome, the perniciousness of which cannot be overstated. Thank you so much to Garrett, who exercises daily, both in musical form and physical form, and as a pilot, which we didn't get to, but we will at some point soon, I promise. And I want to, though, finish up with giving you the final 3 questions in the remaining 5 minutes before we I'll have our friend Eric join the chat for a new live stream. So people, make sure you tune in, stay on this channel, and go over to the link that says Eric Weinstein, Garrett Lisi in Conversation, Theories and Experiments of Everything. We'll start that in about 10 minutes. But before we do that, I'm going to ask in the next 5 minutes questions of Garrett that are the so-called thrilling 3 questions that I ask all my guests. Usually you have to subscribe to my mailing list to get these answers, but today on a live stream, I'm feeling generous. You don't. Everybody will get the answers. And the first one has to do with something called an ethical will. So as you may know, or maybe don't know, but maybe someday we'll find out in person, Alfred Nobel endowed the Nobel Prize with a dual mandate. One was to award and reward scientists for discoveries or inventions in physics and chemistry, etc. But another component was that those discoveries must benefit all mankind. So that was his ethical will, as I call it, or in Hebrew it's called a zava'ah, and that is something distinct from his material will, which left money to fund the Nobel Prize. I want to ask you, what would you put in your ethical will? And it can't be Bitcoin, so take it away. What wisdom would you impart to future generations?
The thing jumping to my mind is Bill and Ted's be excellent to each other.
That's fine. Actually, Sean Carroll said basically that to me in one of his. Very good. Okay, I'll take that. I call that, instead of the categorical imperative, the Bill and Ted imperative. All right. So I mentioned earlier, Kamran Vafa had the statement about what he'd put on a billion-year time capsule, not unlike the giant ominous monolith in 2001 in Space Odyssey, encountered by mankind as a early primitive species in prehistoric Africa, and then later by astronauts on the moon. I want to ask you, if you could make a time capsule and put something on it, in it, a surfboard that's going to last for 1 billion years, what wisdom or what statement about physics, even, as Feynman said, the so-called catastrophe question, what statement encapsulates the most possible information in the fewest possible words? What would Garrett Lisi say about that?
Brian, honestly, I think our existence as humans is so ephemeral and precious, but ultimately insignificant, that I'm not sure there is anything we could impart down 1 billion years that would have any significance whatsoever.
All right, fair enough.
I think our future as humanity is probably to produce synthetically intelligent robots that go out and spawn through the galaxy at a rapid rate, and maybe fondly remember us in some weird computer memory way.
Yes.
But that's probably our ultimate future on the timescale of 1 billion years.
In honor of my favorite science fiction writer, besides Arthur C. Clarke, of course, Isaac Asimov, I call that Bri Robot, Bri Robot, B-R-I Robot. Yeah. Anyway, last question involves Arthur C. Clarke, his so-called third law. You'll know, of course, his first law is any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And we open every podcast with those very words. His second law is for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. And so soon we'll have on an opposite expert in the form of Eric Weinstein. But I want to ask you, his third statement, his third law of nature is the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. I want to ask you, and that's the name of the podcast, Garrett, what seemed impossible to a 20-year-old, a 30-year-old Garrett Lisi, that because of your courage and your indomitable spirit, you accomplished it and went a little bit into the impossible?
You have to try things that seem outlandish. And make the choices that are really, you see, making you happy long term. Even when they seem unlikely. But also hedge.
And someone's asking me about Bitcoin in the last 10 seconds. Yeah. Are you pro, con?
So definitely try for the outlandish, but make sure to hedge so that you'll do okay, even if your outlandish things that you're trying don't work out perfectly.
That's great. And you wouldn't tell your 20-year-old self to buy Bitcoin. Very good. Okay, well, I guess the Apple is sufficient.
It wasn't around until 2010.
Garrett, thank you so much for going into the impossible. Now, stay tuned out there. Please, again, subscribe to the podcast. Follow Garrett on Twitter. I got his handle up there, Garrett at Garrett Lisi. Go to the Pacific Sciences Institute. We'll talk a little bit about funding in academia, the academic Hunger Games. Eric and I are fond of talking about that. And we'll talk about kind of each other's perspectives on each other's theories, and I'll give an aviation analog to that once you guys join me over in the next live stream starting in 4 minutes. So now Garrett and I are going to sign off from this dual live stream and join our friend Eric Weinstein. Stay tuned, subscribe, like, comment, and please join us in just a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.
Been great talking with you, Brian. Looking forward to Eric joining.
Yes.